The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered a wave of shelter-in-place restrictions and closed businesses, but also fear and alienation. The community of those with disabilities and those at greatest risk have also heard increasing calls that they are a liability to society, that society can no longer afford to protect and assist them. Our guest in this week's Challenge 2.0 is a nationally known speaker on disability issues and offers a perspective of what it's like to be disabled during a pandemic, to spend time on a ventilator, and the cost to society of not assisting the disabled to share their gifts and their talents. This week, I'd like to introduce and welcome Alisa Hayes. She is an extraordinary speaker, thought leader, consultant, and I'm happy to say friend as well. Alisa, thank you so much for joining us this week in this episode.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, Alisa, at a time when we've seen all too much evidence of hardened divisions in our country, it seems that the COVID-19 pandemic has only served to harden those divisions further and increase and set new divisions. Which ones, especially with your focus, troubles you the most?
I'm very concerned about the impact on people with disabilities. And frankly, in a year when we are going to have the 30th anniversary of the ADA on July 26th, it feels in many ways like we are rolling back attitudes and potential civil liberties, really rolling back decades with what's going on right now.
Now, you have personal experience in confronting those attitudes and obstacles. As we look on camera right now, it's not evident that you spend much of your time in a wheelchair. Could you share with us a little bit about your story and your journey?
Absolutely. So I owned a company, and we traveled all over the country, primarily to fairs and festivals, live events, those things that we all miss now. We were on our way in 2014 to the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, which is the largest event of its kind in the world, I think. In Oklahoma, with two of my employees, we got caught in an ice storm. I was driving a large pickup truck, a Ford F-250, pulling a trailer behind me. I'd done this for years. None of this was new, but unfortunately, this was March 1st, and a huge weather system had flown into the Central States region. There were over 100 accidents that night, and we were one of them. The trailer that I was pulling hit a patch of black ice on the highway and just slid out. As I say to people, it was in that moment when I'm at the wheel of my truck. I have two 21-year-old employees in this truck. That's the moment when I learned what leadership really looks like. So we ended up stuck jackknifed on the highway. I was able to emergency safely evacuate these two young women. They're alive and well today, but our rig, everything there, was hit by a semi, then by an SUV, then another semi that was going 65 miles an hour. The driver never took it out of cruise control, never touched the brakes, and he hit my body on the run while I was trying to reach the side of the road. I was launched 90 feet through the air, impaled on the cable guardrail down the center median of the highway. And for a few moments, I was still conscious. It was horrific. Amazingly, I don't have a spinal cord injury. I'm not paralyzed. No idea how that happened, but my pelvis folded in half and was crushed in a severe, what's called an open book fracture. Ordinarily, people die from that level of injury, but instead, through a phenomenal amount of mercy in my life, I am sitting here. So I spent 3.5 months hospitalized altogether the first time. It's taken 7 hospitals in 4 states spanning both sides of the continent, plus my brother's kidney, in order to save my life. And part of that, I had all of the gluteal muscles on the left side were amputated in one of my many emergency surgeries because all of that tissue had gone necrotic, dead, and had to be removed. I developed sepsis as part of that. So I joke that I'm a half-assed speaker.
If anyone could see a lighter side of that, it would be you, and it's part of the amazing message you have. Alisa, if I remember correctly, as part of your treatment, you were placed on a ventilator. Of course, we see that now in terms of the critically ill COVID-19 patients. What was that like, and are there any, or were there any lingering side effects from that?
It was horrific. My very first memory in the hospital was when, after about a week and a half, I had been kept in a medically induced coma. They needed to bring me up to consciousness to find out if I had any brain function. And I was still on the vent. I opened my eyes, and what they told my family I would never remember, except I do, which is the crazy part. I open my eyes, realizing I'm on life support machines. My mother's a retired physician, so when I looked through the glass that faced the foot of my bed, and I see that I'm right across from a nurse's station, I think, well, that's not good. And I can't breathe for myself. I can't speak. I can barely communicate other than to give a very slight squeeze of a hand. Mm-hmm. One of the things I remember profoundly was staring at this machine right next to me with all of these numbers that just kept blinking and these lights blinking. I was fixated staring at that machine because those numbers indicated whether or not I was going to stay alive. Mm-hmm. And it was terrifying. I had times where I had to be tied down so tightly to the bed because I would thrash at tubes and try and pull things out, and feeling like I was drowning because I couldn't get any air. After I was tied, because they had to tie me down so tightly because I'm a fighter, as they said, I ended up without the use of my right hand for about 5 months because there was some nerve damage done just from how hard I had to be tied down to prevent trying to yank at those tubes. And so obviously that created some problems. And because of that, I've had problems with my hand ever since, just trying to write. Even my hand doesn't operate as well as it should. I also have my lungs are just weak forever.
And we're going to talk about that because that raises the issue of those that have an experience, that have some disabilities, are at higher risk with this COVID environment. But your story has been incredible, and to say that your life has changed is certainly a vast understatement. Give us a sense of the physical and emotional challenges that you had to face as you moved forth from the accident, from the surgeries over the coming months and even years.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, obviously, the physical challenges that I have, I walk short distances with a cane, and that took excruciating effort just to be able to get to that. And then I use a wheelchair for traveling any distance. I think the bigger challenge is the emotional hurdles. I've talked to a lot of people with disabilities. This is really a common experience. You have especially if you become a disabled person later in life. I was 46 years old when the accident
Hmm.
happened. So I had spent my whole life being active and tough, and I drove big trucks and trailers, and I could hitch things up on the side of the road, and I was tough. I climbed mountains, and and then I'm that poor lady in a wheelchair, and I come up against not only biases out in the world, and we'll talk about that, but I come up
Hmm.
against recognizing the internal biases that I have in
Hmm.
my own head,
Those that evolved.
right, as I realized just the cultural influences of what I believed about people with disabilities. And I would have never told you that I thought people with disabilities were weak, or that they were somehow less than, until I
Hmm.
became one of those people. And then I realized, wow, those conversations are actually going on in my head. And in the little over 6 years that it's been since the accident, that's been a constant struggle, even for myself, coming up against that.
Hmm.
And then, of course, I had PTSD, which during COVID has been called by my healthcare providers as a hugely acute phase of everything being triggered
Hmm.
because of all of the talk about ventilators, because the world is now a very threatening place for me, due to the kidney transplant. My kidneys failed because of the wreck. So due to the transplant, I take anti-rejection meds, which are designed to lower the immune system.
Over these months in which we've had shelter in place, what did that mean for what you could or couldn't do? And where are you at right now with that as things open? And we know in Washington state more cautiously than most states, but as they begin to open, how are you responding to that? What's life been like the last few months?
Quiet.
Yeah.
As a professional speaker and a consultant, I traveled around the country. I very quickly got back to my life traveling, except I just
Hmm.
learned how to do it differently. In my wheelchair, I have a little service dog, um, and we would just traipse all over the country and do our thing. I got home after a week-long tour at 3 different events to find out that COVID-19 had hit Western Washington,
Hmm.
and I haven't been anywhere since. All of my engagements canceled.
Once they do come up with a vaccine, how might that interact given, your condition? I would think that anyone suffering from a disability that experiences that is going to have to look at the safety issue of reemerging into outside activities very differently than, say, those of us that don't have at least those obvious disabilities. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. The impacts to who we call vulnerable people
Hmm.
is so much broader than people realize, it seems. And they are all feeling the same way that I am, even though they don't take the same kind of medications that I do.
We've heard the expression by some that it's not the responsibility of society to offer protection or assistance to those experiencing disabilities, especially in this time of the pandemic. What examples of that have you heard? And what is your reaction, both intellectually but also emotionally, when you hear something like that?
I've definitely heard it. I have literally been told by somebody, I'm sorry that you feel like you're at risk. I don't feel like I am. I really am.
Yeah.
And she said, but your health is not my responsibility. Straight out just said that. It just breaks my heart that people have this kind of attitude, because it's our responsibility to take care of each other.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, that goes all the way to bigger conversations about climate change. Of course, we're responsible for each other's health.
Hmm.
People are so easy to dismiss health issues for other people, particularly in the United States. America has sometimes this fierce independence, which is fantastic,
Hmm.
but it also prevents a tremendous amount of compassion. It can.
Well, it seems very often when we have events, be it a serious accident, maybe a pandemic, that there's a great deal of sympathy and connection that emerges for a while, but it seems like there's a high fatigue factor that sets in very quickly. And it becomes yesterday's news. And, that ability, that willingness to assist others really seems to diminish. Is that a fair statement? Is that your experience?
Absolutely. So initially, when the pandemic first started, people were like, well, I'm going to bake bread and clean my garage and we'll wait this out. Their prefrontal cortex is operating.
Yeah.
They're thinking creative, they're thinking playfully, they're thinking productively, all prefrontal cortex type activity. But as the pandemic wears on and people's livelihoods are threatened, their independence becomes threatened, that feeling of threat activates the amygdala, baby lizard brain, what I call it. And in doing that, if people don't recognize, okay, what's happening here is I'm feeling threatened, which causes me to be incredibly self-focused because it's about self-preservation. And
Mhm.
therefore, I'm not being a compassionate person. Most people haven't developed the level of mindful awareness to hear those conversations in their head, to
Mhm.
see that that's happening. And so instead, they lash out on social media, they lash out on the mainstream media. We have people in leadership lashing out and saying things that come from this lack of compassion place.
Mhm. And yet, as you've pointed out so well, I know just in conversations we've had, that boundary that many people seem to believe exists between themselves and those that are experiencing a disability of some sort, that's not a permanent division. That's not a permanent boundary by any means, is it?
No, we say that disability is the only minority you can join at any time, and you
Mhm.
will if you don't die first. It so part of the reason that people have such an aversion to disability is it represents their own frailty. And we like to think of ourselves as invincible.
Mhm.
So the more we can other those people, then the less we feel vulnerable to the whims of whatever can happen. But the reality is anybody could be just like me at any
Mhm.
moment.
And it probably comes as a great surprise, as you said. One moment you were used to wrestling around trucks and trailers and that sort of thing, and suddenly you couldn't. Do you find that those that have had suddenly that experience, that there is an initial unwillingness to accept some of the outreach that I know is so available, and I want to give some of that in this program, but that there's an initial reluctance because it's an admission that that person is no longer the way they used to be?
I think people don't even know where to reach out to
Yeah.
begin with. And it depends on what the disability is. If, for example, if a person becomes injured and they have a spinal cord injury, they're often sent to hospitals that specialize in that and care providers who specialize that who will connect them with resources. But
Mhm.
if you don't have an injury that falls into a category where there's not a category for people who've been body slammed by semi trucks. That's it's not really a support group for that.
Mhm.
So, um, so if you have an illness or an injury or a child diagnosed with something, if it's not neatly within a category, even the healthcare providers don't know what resources to offer
Mhm.
you, and they focus really on fixing what they can, and they're really not focused on how do you go live your life, how
Mhm.
do you function. And so oftentimes people will struggle along by themselves because they don't know what else to do.
This is not a new issue either, is it, Alisa? We talk about it as it exists right now, but in fact, I believe that you had a trip to Washington, D.C. some years ago, and you went into the Holocaust Museum and you saw this antipathy to the needs of those that have disabilities. In fact, has existed for decades, centuries, and in fact have been part of some of the worst, what shall I say, the worst examples of inhumanity to each other.
Absolutely. So my family, we took a trip to Washington, D.C. in 2015. Went to the Holocaust Museum, and I was really interested in seeing the exhibit on the Rwandan genocide. I had read the book by Immaculée Ilibagiza called Left to Tell.
Mm-hmm.
Highly recommend it. Great book. So I'm rolling around just getting educated and being sad for humanity. I turned a corner, and there was behind glass a big display and articles about how the very first people that Hitler rounded up, institutionalized, and euthanized were people with disabilities. I was sitting there in my wheelchair. I'm getting goosebumps actually just reading this. Sitting there in my wheelchair looking at this display with glass in front of it, and my own reflection is reflected in the glass.
Really? You had a feeling that, separated, if you had been in a different country at a different time, that would have been you.
That would have been me. And it brought it so home. And it's one of the things that my husband and I have talked about when we've had conflicts and situations where we've been in the world and really been discriminated against. My husband said to one man, "You would feel differently if this was your wife, your family." And I think that's true for so much of what's going on in the world right now. You would feel differently if this was really home to you.
Mm-hmm. We can project on what the reasoning was, but could you just educate us a little bit in terms of what was the rationale in Nazi Germany for singling out those with disabilities first?
Right. Disability in general and public views of it have gone through a series of phases. And one of those phases is that people with disabilities are defective.
Mm-hmm.
They are, in many cultures, going back, predating modern era, they were just like, well, that one was broken, a lack of value of humanity. And so the Nazi regime, in their effort to create what they believe would be a perfect society, the answer to that is, of course, to get rid of things that aren't perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that's not perfect is broken people, whether that's intellectual disabilities. There's an enormous amount of that,
Mm-hmm.
of people forcibly institutionalized, abused, starved, ultimately euthanized. People with physical disabilities. There have even been, in our own country, many laws on the books of it illegal for a disabled person to be a beggar because it was unsightly. And in Hitler's Germany, unsightly people didn't fit.
Was there also an economic aspect to that too in Nazi Germany, Alisa?
People with disabilities, vulnerable people in general, are viewed as being a burden and expense. Now, that's not actually true. That does not actually bear with the research.
We have seen this throughout the last few decades as well, have we not?
Yes, absolutely. It wasn't until 21 years ago, 1999, that we passed the Olmstead Act in the United States. The Olmstead Act, which was a landmark Supreme Court decision, which made it illegal to forcibly institutionalize people with disabilities.
What sort of messages, what sort of mission do you serve in your work?
My mission is to help leaders build resilient teams of people that want to be socially conscious, to create a socially conscious impact in the world for all people, an inclusive impact. and to help people with disabilities to be a part of that, to be part of those conversations, to have a seat at the table.
And in terms of that idea of resilience, I think you've also written a book fairly recently. Tell us about that.
I wrote a book called Letters to My Daughter. And really the premise behind that, and the premise behind the title was that my youngest child, she was in the 8th grade when the accident happened. And in the 8th grade, she had to start acting like the mom in the house. And had I died, who would have told her all of these things about how to grow up strong and resilient
Right.
and kind?
Well, Alisa, thank you so much for sharing what we've been able to share so far. And I think that's going to give us a much better foundation for not only being able to gain a clearer picture in terms of what we're seeing in a reaction around us, but also the challenges, the difficulties that people that have these disabilities face. In the next episode, what I'd like to do is explore what maybe people are not aware of as much in terms of the contributions and also how we can better work together to avoid some of these problems. So Alisa, again, thank you so much for joining us today. And everybody else, I hope you'll tune in again and catch the continuation of this conversation in Challenge 2.0 next week. Thank you.